What's up, everyone? Hit that subscribe button because this final story is about remembering why we tell stories in the first place. Let me take you to New Orleans, Louisiana, where this begins and ends. What's up, everyone? Hit that subscribe button because this story is about remembering why we tell stories in the first place. Let me take you to New Orleans, Louisiana, where this begins and ends. Mason was a novelist. Had been writing professionally for 15 years, published 8 books, made decent money, had actual readers who waited for his next release. He wrote literary fiction, the kind that gets reviewed in important places, that wins awards occasionally, that matters in ways beyond sales numbers. And he'd loved it for years, the craft, the challenge, the magic of creating worlds from nothing. Writing was his purpose, his identity, his contribution. Then he hit a wall. Not writer's block exactly, worse. He could still write technically. Could still construct sentences, build paragraphs, manage pacing. But the stories felt empty. Felt like he was just rearranging words into familiar patterns without actually saying anything. He'd sit at his desk in his shotgun house in Bywater and type and delete, producing nothing that felt alive. Nothing that felt true. Nothing that felt like it needed to exist. His editor was patient initially. Take your time. It'll come back. But a year passed. No new book. No progress on the manuscript he'd been contracted to write. His publisher was getting nervous. Mason was getting desperate. He'd try writing exercises, prompts, anything to break through. But it all felt performative. Felt like he was playing at being a writer instead of actually writing. By 43, after a year and a half of this, Mason was starting to accept a terrible truth: maybe he was done. Maybe he'd said everything he had to say. Maybe some people only have a finite number of stories in them, and he'd used his up. The thought was devastating. Without writing, who was he? What was he for? His whole adult life had been built around storytelling, and if he couldn't tell stories anymore, what was left? His therapist suggested he might be depressed. Mason knew he was depressed. How could he not be when his purpose had disappeared? But medication didn't bring back the stories. Didn't make anything feel worth writing about. He'd walk through the French Quarter, a neighborhood full of characters and drama and life, and feel nothing. No curiosity. No what if. No stories appearing. Just emptiness. He stopped leaving his house much. Stopped reading, too painful to read good books when he couldn't write them. Stopped seeing friends in the local writing community, couldn't bear their well-meaning questions about his work. Just sat in his house, staring at blank pages, feeling like a dried-up well. Feeling like he'd given all his water away and there was nothing left to draw from. Late summer in New Orleans is oppressive. Heat that makes thinking hard, humidity that makes breathing harder. Mason was sitting on his back porch at sunset, only time of day when outside was tolerable, when a cat appeared. Tiny calico kitten, maybe 8 weeks old, skinny and scraggly. Walked right up to Mason, meowed loudly, and climbed into his lap without invitation. Mason stared at this kitten. She stared back with green eyes too big for her face. And Mason felt the smallest flicker of something. Not a story, not yet. Just interest. Who was this cat? Where had she come from? What was her story? The questions appeared automatically, writer's instinct kicking in despite the drought. He fed her some leftover chicken. She devoured it. Gave her water. She drank like she'd been wandering the desert. Set up a box with a towel for her to sleep in. She ignored the box, curled up on his lap, and passed out immediately. And Mason sat there with this tiny creature trusting him completely, and felt the faintest pulse of purpose. This cat needed him. Not for a story. For care. For survival. For simple, concrete reasons that had nothing to do with art or writing or identity. He named her Story. Seemed appropriate. She'd appeared when he had no stories left. Maybe she was a story herself. Maybe she'd remind him how stories worked. You notice something small, you pay attention, you see where it goes. You don't force it. You just witness and record. Here's what happened. Story gave Mason something to pay attention to. He'd watch her play, attacking imaginary enemies, climbing furniture she couldn't get down from, falling asleep in bizarre positions. And he'd find himself narrating in his head. The tiny warrior faced her greatest enemy, the red dot she could never quite catch. The explorer discovered a new territory, under the couch, where forgotten toys lived. He started writing again. Not his novel. Not anything he was supposed to be writing. Just observations about Story. Little character sketches. Moments that felt true. Nothing profound, nothing literary, just honest documentation of this small creature navigating her world. And the words came easily because he wasn't trying to make them matter. Wasn't trying to make them art. Just trying to capture what he was seeing. Story was endlessly interesting. Would do something new every day. Would surprise him constantly with her personality, bold but affectionate, independent but needy, graceful but clumsy. And Mason realized he'd forgotten that this is where stories come from. Not from trying to be important or literary or award-winning. From paying attention. From noticing. From being genuinely curious about something other than yourself. About 3 months after getting Story, Mason started working on his novel again. But differently. Less concerned with being impressive, more concerned with being honest. Less focused on literary techniques, more focused on capturing something true. The writing felt different. Felt alive in ways it hadn't in years. His editor read the new pages and said, "There you are. I missed this voice." Story would sit on Mason's desk while he wrote. Would occasionally walk across the keyboard, contributing random letters. And Mason would laugh and fix it and keep going. Because Story had taught him something essential: the story doesn't have to be perfect to matter. It just has to be true. It just has to notice something worth noticing and share it honestly. Mason's book came out a year later. It was different from his previous work, quieter, more observational, less concerned with big themes. Critics called it his most mature work. Readers said it felt more personal, more real. The dedication read, "For Story, who reminded me why we tell stories in the first place." Mason is 45 now. Story is 2. They have their routines: morning coffee while Story demands breakfast, afternoon walks around the neighborhood with Story following, evening writing while Story supervises. And through it all, Mason is remembering that writing isn't about having important things to say. It's about paying attention. It's about noticing. It's about being genuinely curious about the world. And cats, with their endless curiosity and complete presence, are perfect teachers of that. Here's what Mason told me: "I thought I'd run out of stories. Thought I'd said everything I had to say. But I hadn't run out of stories, I'd stopped paying attention. I'd gotten so focused on writing important literature that I forgot how to just notice things. Story taught me to look again. To be curious again. To remember that every moment, every creature, every small thing has a story if you're willing to see it. The stories were always there. I just had to remember how to find them." That's the lesson for every creative person who's hit the wall. You haven't run out. You've just forgotten how to see. You've made it too complicated, too important, too heavy. But creation is simple. It's noticing. It's caring. It's sharing what you see honestly. And sometimes you need a tiny calico kitten to remind you of that. So here's my final question for you: what have you stopped noticing? What stories are you missing because you're too busy trying to force them? For Mason, it was a kitten who showed him that stories are everywhere if you're willing to look. What might you see if you looked again? Drop your story in the comments. Tell me about finding your creativity again. Tell me about cats who taught you to notice. Tell me about remembering why you started creating in the first place. Someone reading this has lost their creative spark, thinks they are done, and they need to hear that they are not. That the stories are still there. That they just need to remember how to see them. Thanks for watching, folks. If these stories resonate with you, hit the like button, subscribe because there are always more stories to tell, and be mindful tonight. Notice the little things. Be curious about the ordinary. Your next story is waiting for you. Until next time, remember, you're not done. You just forgot to look. Cats know. It's time to listen to them. Mio for now.